Right, let's start the conference off with our first keynote speaker. We're going to be joined by Annmarie O'Kane, I think. Annmarie O'Kane is not the speaker, but she will be facilitating the Q&A. Annmarie, if you don't know, is from the Centre for Cross-Border Studies and also works on a project called Border People. And if you don't know about Border People, it's a fabulous part of the work of the Centre. Please Google it and you'll find out a little bit more. The first keynote speaker, however, is somebody who won't mind me saying, I hope, that she's occupied a leadership role in civil society and many other ways in this part of the world for, believe it or not, I'm trying to find where she's sitting so that she can make a face at me if I get this wrong. Oh, there she is there. She can't hear me. For over 50 years. Bernadette McAliskey started out as a child in that leadership role, nearly. And over those 50-odd years or so, I'm not going to read out her bio, but I think we all know that she's never been frightened to say truth to power, to say what she thinks, to challenge and be challenged, and that's what she's going to do this morning. She has been a constant advocate of the demographic change that we have seen on this island, north and south, with new people coming to make their home in this part of the world and contributing so much to the social, cultural, and economic future of this place. I'm delighted that we have Bernadette McAliskey to start this conference off, and please give a warm welcome, Bernadette McAliskey.
Good morning, everybody. I hope that's okay with the... Yep, thank you. I was wondering when I met Anthony Soares at a social event some time ago. We were having a discussion on what kept both of us and most of the people who were at the event. We were sharing what kept us doing what we did in the face of increasing challenge. And I suggested to Anthony it was downright stubbornness. And Anthony, being much more of a diplomat than myself, thought commitment, resilience, and perseverance was probably a better way of putting that. So that reminded him then that I might be cajoled into speaking at the Cross-Border Study Conference, which was organising on that theme. And I'm very pleased and very honoured and privileged to do so. I've worked, in fact, worked with Anthony in a different guise from 2000, I think, Anthony, when as a PhD student he undertook the first bit of research with the Multicultural Resource Centre and ourselves. We were a fairly new organisation in Dungannon around the recent immigration of significant numbers of Portuguese people to work in the agri-food industry in Dungannon. And I've worked with the Cross-Border Studies group under the leadership of many of its leaders, including my good colleague Ruth Tyan, who I see is also here today. What was interesting in the course of our conversation was, what would I say to the, which is always I say, what do you expect me to say to these people, Anthony? And in the discussion, it occurred to us that what I needed to talk about was holding the centre. And I find that quite ironic that I should speak to anybody about holding the centre, because the centre is not where I exist. After some 50 years in politics with large and small P's, and in public agitation and organising, the centre is not a space I occupy. In fact, I'm still waiting to see anybody further to the left than myself. Apart from Eamon McCann, I haven't met them yet. So there's something slightly ironic about addressing you all this morning on holding the centre. But I think it is an important question that has to be asked, particularly in the current economic, social, political, ecological circumstances in which we find ourselves, the core question we have to ask about all of our survival is, will the centre hold? Because if it doesn't, we're all in trouble. And it's not my job to hold the centre. That's why it's easier for me to talk about it. And my concern about that issue was precisely because I work at the edges of society. It's where I was born, it was where I grew up. But after a period of time in the centre, the lesson I learned was that I belong at the edges. That's where I work best. That's where the most creativity is in terms of early recognition of what's going wrong. It starts to go wrong at the edges first. And so if you're living and working there, you have early warning systems about where the cracks in society are, where the inequalities, where the problems, outworking of poor decisions are felt first. And as we were having our conversation, I had made the point to Anthony that one of my biggest concerns is the number of people who would consider themselves to be in the centre, who are consistently being pushed further and further out. So we have this kind of paradox within the whole island of Ireland at the minute, that at the one time there is a lot, and when you try to look at it, it's amazing how much work there is that is going on about north, south, east, west, neighbour to neighbour, organisation to organisation, corporation to corporation, politician to politician, party to party. How much common work there is that's going on against a background where almost as much is going on to pull it apart. I have never seen in that sense a more dynamic and fluid context than the one we're in. And it can be quite frightening because the ground beneath our feet isn't safe. The ground between our feet isn't steady for more and more people who up until now have never really felt that movement. You know, like when you stand on a boat and the water gets choppy. More and more people in our society are feeling the ground moving beneath their feet. And just when you try to think, when we had this conversation, I tell you, it wasn't moving half as quickly as it's currently moving. So if you're in a position, for example, on the northern side of the border, and it certainly affects those who live on the southern side of it, just when you think things can't get worse in many ways, you wake up and discover that the Conservative government has entirely lost its marbles. That's the only explanation I can think of. That the government has, in a moment of madness, and I said, you know, because I do just say it, I said either a communal loss of sanity has set in, or we are engaged in the outworkings of some Oxford student wheeze, where a number of very wealthy brats at university in their late teens, early 20s, thought it would be hilarious for them all to go into politics, get into government, do the country over, resign, head back to the shooting and horse riding, or whatever else it is they do, gambling and drinking, I have no idea, and leave somebody else to clean up the mess, chuckling to themselves that they'd pulled it off. Because I can think of no other reason why, having arrived in a position of government, the most conservative element of the UK government turned rogue and left the pound worth very little, left people in the country who are usually safe and secure, not knowing, for the first time in their lives possibly, how secure the roof over, literally, the roof over their family's head is this week and next week. And you have, this is a Conservative government. The meaning of Conservative has been lost here. This is the biggest gamble I have seen in the country since Gerry Adams signed the Good Friday Agreement. And at least I think Gerry Adams had a plan. I used to say to him, Gerry, what's your plan B if that doesn't work out? And he said, plan B is there is no plan B. That was the stupidest thing I ever heard anybody say in their lives. Plan B is there's no plan B. But I'm now looking at people running the United Kingdom who appear to have no plan B and made a major gamble. It's the way my head works. I was saying to Peter last night, the way my head works is it doesn't matter what anybody says, how far they disagree with me, before I start to argue with them. I say it must have made sense to them. It may not make sense to me, but it must have made sense to you. So I do try to think through the rationale that got the person to the position they're arguing, because then that allows me to understand how I need to counter that argument. But for the life of me, I cannot see. I'd be interested in anybody that can spell out for me what they think they're doing. I can't see. I cannot see how in the present global, national, international position, we ended up with a decision that was taken in Cabinet a couple of days ago. And that it just adds, for the people that I live amongst and work with, such an element of fear, because they are not the people who for the first time in their lives are wondering about mortgage rates and whether their reasonably good incomes will meet their outgoing expenditure over this winter, now that an increase in mortgage rates up to maybe 6% is in the play. I work with people who will pay on the end of that a significant increase in rents and shortage of rental accommodation, to the extent that they will be looking at homelessness, not because yesterday or before this happened they were making difficult choices between heating and eating in order to ensure they could pay the rent. The ground has shifted. So they now will possibly not be able to meet the rent regardless of the steps that have been taken to keep people fed and warm over the winter. And that's a level of crisis that we are in. We're seeing working people, even with wage increases, which are settling somewhere in the public sector around 2.5%, unless you're working for councils and have bin strikes. The power of labour is wonderful, especially when you're emptying the rubbish. You value your bin men and women when they all go on strike. So in the north, there have been wage increases up to about 10% in local councils. Local councils are not private organisations, and they're not profit-making organisations. So local councils are going to have to pay for wages by increasing rates. It's a circle. And if you follow it through, you'll see what I'm trying to say here is that the kind of problems with which the people on the edges of society grapple daily in order to maintain some kind of economic stability, in order to make the income match the basic expenditure, which is a daily and weekly battle if you are a single parent, if you are an immigrant working regardless of your qualifications, your skill or expertise in your home country, you're working at filleting chickens or changing beds in hotels in this country. Or if you're a person with a disability who is unable to work, if you're a single parent trying to part-time work between work and childcare, that underlying sense of uncertainty and fear that this may be the week you won't make it is now a sentiment that at this point is creeping up to anybody in the North who has an income, a gross income of less than the average working wage. And the average working wage is somewhere around £26,500. And my day-and-day work in the organisation I work and the people I work with is working with people at the edge and doing that basic, maximising your income, minimising your basic expenditure so that you minimise the debt and the borrowing on a weekly basis. I should be the Chancellor of the Exchequer at this stage. I now know what Lenin meant when he said the kitchen maid could run the country. If you can manage to make insufficient income meet basic expenditure, you ought to be running both sides of the border. But the reality of life is that people in the centre, north and south of the border, are increasingly facing that personal, that family, that community problem. And not simply wage earners. We're looking at small businesses. And I think sometimes what people forget is that small and medium businesses, farm families, family-owned local businesses in rural, semi-rural, and even in urban contexts are the backbone of our society. Yes, we have the big internationals coming in and paying less tax than the rest of us on both sides of the border. But the mainstay of our lives, of our economic backbone, are not the data people, are not the IT people, are not the big multinational factories who own our agri-food industry. They are the small businesses that serve those big industries. And our small family business owners, our small, medium enterprise owners are also saying, I can't make this equation work. And this is particularly true in the North, where we have been looking not at a tsunami, but a succession of tsunamis. We left the European Union. Important to say from a democratic point of view, we did not vote to leave the European Union. On a regional basis, we in the North did not vote to leave the European Union. I don't hold an uncritical position in the European Union, but if I was going to leave it, I'd have left it with Greece, who were arguing for a more democratic basis of the distribution of wealth and power in the European Union, than on the back of a conservative government that wanted to leave the European Union not because of its weaknesses, but because of its strengths, because of its protection of human rights, because of its cooperation, because of its support for diversity, because of its degree of solidarity and cooperation, notwithstanding its weaknesses in terms of the people outside the European Union with a right to seek shelter in it. So we were taken out of that union against our better judgment and will, against the context in which the European Union had played a significant role in building the peace, both on a basis of reconciliation, on a basis of equality and rights, and on a basis of the reduction of poverty. And then having left that, we became paralysed in what is a faux debate, and it has to be called that. It is a false debate around the protocol. Yes, there are issues, as with any protocol, that need to be resolved and worked out. But the idea that the protocol threatens the peace, the stability, is a lie. It's a lie. What threatens the peace and stability is the right-wing policies of one party who have distorted and been allowed to distort that question to hold the rest of the country to ransom. So as we come out of Brexit, as we come into a position of economic decline as a result of Brexit, we find ourselves in the North paralysed without a working executive. We're going into the winter in which, without state intervention, and we've seen that on both sides of the border, and we've seen it broader, further afield. We are in, and I want to say, because I do have to say this, it's a disgrace that we're in this position. It's a disgrace. With due respect to one of our key speakers, it's a disgrace to the Irish government. It is a disgrace to the British government, and it is a disgrace to the Northern Ireland executive that we are in this position. The United Kingdom, up until very recently, was the 5th wealthiest country in the world. If you were the Indian government, you would have a slight wry and ironic smile to yourself that you had just dislodged your previous colonizer and become the 5th wealthiest nation in the world, moving the UK to the 6th. You might also, if you were India, look at the level of poverty in your own country and ask if that's not a disgrace. But the UK is the 6th wealthiest country in the world. And the Republic of Ireland, do you know where you sit? Those of you who are from, do you know where this small half a nation, whole state sits right now? 4th. 4th. You don't believe me? Look it up. 4th. And yet we are looking that we need emergency state intervention on both sides of the border to keep the citizens and the residents of this island free from destitution over the winter months. Something's not right here. And it has crept so far up that the centre may not hold. The centre may not hold. Now, part of me, because I'm an anarchist at heart, says, what an interesting time to be alive. But part of me also more realistically says, if the centre won't hold, what will happen to the people I currently work with? Because they have nothing else to give. They have nowhere else to go. And we are sitting on 2 islands off the west coast of Europe, not in the southern hemisphere, not in 1845. In 2022, we are sitting in 2 wealthy islands off the main coast of Europe, knowing that there will be people die of destitution on these islands over the next 6 to 8 months without significant temporary state intervention to keep people fed, warm, and clothed. And we're doing that in a context. We're doing that in a context where the whole world is in trouble, having exhausted the patience of Mother Nature herself. So we don't know where we're going, but we can see not in the distant future. We can see in the present. And I remind everybody again, we live on 2 islands. The water is rising now. The flood waters are rising now. The inability to be able to forecast the weather is happening now. Wildfires are happening now. So here we are with a period of time where we know we have brave, courageous, and difficult decisions to take to save the species. People keep saying save the planet. This planet is not under threat. We are. We are. We are, when we talk about the planet not surviving, that's because we think we are it. We're not. We're a parasitic species on the face of the earth. I think that's what we'll be remembered as. We were invented or created or evolved, I don't know which, but our contribution to the planet has been that we destroyed it. That at the end of the day, when you forget all the other wee bits, our overall contribution to the planet on which we live is that we have screwed it up. And our battle is to save ourselves. Because if you look at all the wee derelict cottages around Ireland, you'll see when the people leave, nature just takes over. You know? The nettles will survive, the bees will survive, the ivy will grow. It's us that will disappear. So we have a limited time to put it right. We have a limited time to sort out and reverse the damage we're doing to our own environment, while at the same time reverse the damage we're doing to our own species. And there are big decisions to be taken. Because our problem isn't poverty. Our problem is greed. Greed causes poverty. Our problem isn't poverty. Poverty is the end result of our problem. Our problem is the insatiable greed of individuals and collective groups of people who think it's a wheeze to crash the market, who gamble on the market, who gamble with bonds the way poor people back horses in half-crowns still. They get treatment for addiction to gambling, but the market ruins our lives. The bondholder control. What do they want with all this money? How much can they eat? How much can they drink? How many yachts can you sail at a time? It's an insatiable addiction to greed that is challenging us all. And unless the centre picks its side, the centre won't hold. So I'm just, having said, my husband always says at this point, God burned it, I was in good form till you started. Having said that, can we reverse it? Yes, we can. Can we turn this around with commitment, with resilience, with perseverance? Yes, we can. But we have to. And therefore, just as we look at the Tory government going berserk, sanity has to prevail everywhere else. I'm coming from another conference where differently, when we look at all the problems it faces, we were looking, as at this conference, on the degree of cooperation, north, south, east and west. The goodwill, the capacity, the concentration on building relationships that will work, on finding solutions that will work, the intellectual capacity to solve this problem is in this room. It's in the room of the conference I left. It's on these islands. But if the people in the centre do not take their stand against the right, the left is coming for you. Because something has to give. And either we begin to move together, one, to find a more democratic distribution of wealth. I would tell you that's by owning the means of production, but you don't want to hear that, so I'm not going to waste my breath on that. But everybody knows we need a more democratic distribution of wealth. Everybody knows we need a more democratic distribution of authority. And there are four pillars of democracy, to my mind, that have to be upheld: transparency, openness, participation, and accountability. And if we can work together to get the centre to be transparent, accountable, participatory, in letting the edges speak, in hearing the voice from the outside, because the people who have the problem may not have the experience, the resources to resolve it. But if you don't listen to the people on the edges, you don't know what the problem is, because you haven't felt it yet. But if you want early warnings of the problem, you need to speak to the people at the edges of society. And think of it as kneading bread. If you start at the outside and pull it in, you have room then in kneading it to push it out, and pull it in and push it out. That's my daily work. Pull it in, push it out. But what's happening at the minute is it's just pushing out and pushing out and pushing out. So it's as simple as that. What happens in the middle is you get one great big hole. There's nothing else to push out. And at that point, you don't have the makings of a loaf. You have a destroyed piece of kneading bread, and nobody gets to eat. So I'm going to, because I always like, just in case people think I have mellowed, I'm going to sum up just what I've said. We are coming to a point in human society where Rosa Luxemburg may well be quoted again. Our stark choice could be between barbarism or socialism. I'll tell you about socialism another day, but if you don't do something, we're headed for barbarism and the destruction of humanity. Thank you.
Wow. Is this turned on? So what do you say after that? Wow. I suppose on the button, as always, really interesting, giving us lots of things to think about, and we're in a room full of thinkers and doers. So we have time now for a few questions from the audience. I think we have a few mics around there, so if you can make yourself known if you do have a question. We've only a few minutes. Just here, Tricia.
I shouldn't really be speaking up, but this stuff always gets me going. And in my past, I've been with Friends of the Earth for 10 years, and I hear everything you say. I just despair, because we are essentially chimpanzees, and we are not the nice monkeys, we're the nasty ones. So I just despair at the thought that altruism can prevail with our species, and that is it not that our fatal flaw has already written the ending? When you say that there's hope, I struggle with that, because unlike a bunny rabbit or a gerbil, we cannot live within our own footprint because we don't know how to, and we don't have any other planet. So I know that's a very overarching comment, and this isn't a green conference, but that's my interest, is your view on that. Thank you.
I'm just trying to sort it in terms of, the first thing I would say is, somebody else asked me about despair, and I never despair, simply because my brain doesn't know how that works. It's just not, I think if I could figure out what that actually meant, I might be on the point of it myself. But it's not the way my brain works. I am, and I suppose that's a very human way to be, that if it's broken, it has to be fixed. I think that's where resilience comes in, and I think maybe sometimes at an individual level that comes from one's own lived experience. And I think if we could figure out what creates resilience, we could bottle it, because it's not something that is. I do think that I am blessed, however it came about, that resilience is my default position, stubbornness. But I don't think that we are on the point of despair. I think where we are is on the point of fear of moving beyond our own footprint. But the solution is beyond our own footprint. And when I close with saying, I'll talk about socialism another day. I'm not going to get into a political debate between, the left and the right. But I think because we think like that, to an extent, there are certain solutions that this group of people will not envisage, because it takes you into the political ideology of that group of people. And we're quite honed into that in the North. Don't say anything that might make you sound like a unionist, or don't say anything that might make you sound like a nationalist. God almighty, the world would fall down. But unless we learn to step out of that comfort zone, one of the things that we're looking at, if we look at our economic problem for a start, we can't say, it is not open to a government to say we haven't enough money. If you were a small business owner and you turned up to the bank and said, I don't have enough money, bank would tell you to fold up. Bank would tell you to go into voluntary liquidation if you didn't have enough money and you didn't have enough credibility to borrow it. So it's not open to our government to say they don't have enough money. Governments have the means of creating money. And the way to create money that is sustainable is not about altruism, it's about the social contract of society. That those who have significant excess money must put it into the public purse, and it's called taxation. It's not revolutionary, it's not socialist, but it is, if you put it in the words of people before profit, it's the rich must pay. If you put it in the vocabulary of the state, it is fair taxation. It's the same thing. If we look at the ecology, we have to, yes, it's difficult, but we have to recognize, not in the far distant future, but in the present, that we have to do something around, we're an island. The first place that's going to flood when the water rises is us. I live on the shores of Lough Neagh. If the water level of Lough Neagh rises, I'm going to be amongst the people who have to move first or float into. So we can look at that. We have to break it down into doable things. And those solutions do not defy us. It is the bravery to step outside of our ideological comfort zones and do them. And it's the, you see it everywhere. The government won't do it because the opposition asked for it. The left won't agree to it because it looks like a right wing, vice versa. But we are in a position at the minute where we have to look at what is the problem and what is the rational, sustainable solution, regardless of who suggested it, who thought it, and then we have to do it. And that may mean that those who think society doesn't exist have to be made to remember that it does. And I'm not saying necessarily at the people, but we'll find that out if the people, if the 1%, because it's not any more than that, it's a global 1%, who keep this spinning. We have to, nationally, internationally, and across borders, put a rational, not an ideological, but a rational argument forward for releasing the resources that are held by 1% of the population so that they can be used to take forward what we need to do to reform the way we work, to radically reform the way we work and live so that we can survive.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I wanted to get your view on something that struck me a couple of years ago, looking at coverage of one of the many British elections. There was a man interviewed in a food bank in the east part of England, and they asked him who he was planning to vote for in the election, and he said he would be backing Boris Johnson. And you know, the man's obviously entitled to make whatever choice he wishes about voting, but it just struck me that a man who was accessing a food bank with his family is a victim of some of the policies that Boris Johnson's government were pursuing, and yet he felt he wanted to support them. And I wanted you to have a view on that, where people are very disadvantaged by a particular government still support them.
Well, yeah, I think it's a very important question, and there's two things about it. And I'll give you a very brief example of sometimes how the psychology of that works. We were, when I many years ago was displaced from my rural idyllic home into Coal Island, we were living on a river park on an estate that might have been Coal Island's equivalent of Ballymun many years ago. And again, because that's the nature of me, I wasn't long there till I was organising a tenants group and whatever. Very socially disadvantaged area. And we decided Butlins was still a holiday camp rather than a prison. And we decided we would all gather up some, we'd try and gather up the price of giving everybody on the estate a day out to Butlins. And so we'd all go on a couple of buses and we'd have a raffle, and because many of the children had never been away anywhere. So we'd gathered up some of the other mums on the estate, and we had raffle tickets and we were going around selling them. And one of the young women came back and said a woman had closed the door in her face. And so I found out who that was, so I'd go and talk to her and say, I'll find out why she did that. And the woman said to me, this woman came selling tickets. And I asked her, was this to take deprived children on the holiday? She said, I'd have bought 2 books of tickets. But she said, no, they're our own children. And because the person, the deprived mum, didn't see herself as one of those deprived people. She saw herself as a human being. And she saw people, she considered deprived people to be people even worse off than she was. So when you get politicians talking about, especially in very negative ways, about people who have suffer the uneven distribution of wealth as being wasters, lazy, idle, uneducated, drinking the money, neglecting their children. Even you're in that economic bracket, you think they're talking about somebody else. And you agree with them. because it's not you. In fact, if you're living on benefits because you have to, the person who annoys you most is the person you read off in the media who's a benefit cheat. And you forget that, in fact, the people up here think everybody on benefits is a benefit cheat. And the weight of blaming the other. And the media has a great role and responsibility in this. There is no balance, just because I don't think RTE know this, or BBC, or The Independent know this. There is no balance, journalistic balance, between the truth and a lie, between information and misinformation. And yet they are presented, if we go, for example, through the COVID period, you couldn't talk about vaccinations, scientifically proved vaccinations, without giving the other side an opportunity to talk rubbish. In the North, you can barely talk about climate change without giving the other side a chance to talk about creationism and the world be made in 7 days. And so, it's perfectly understandable in a world of blame the other and disinformation that the people with the least access to information and the truth, because they are excluded from discussions, believe what makes them feel better about themselves and have some explanation for what's happening. Now, from my own point of view, I think if the left and the centre left stop talking in words of 10 syllables, that would also help, or in great economic language. What keeps people like Boris Johnson popular is they speak in the language of people. And it's very clever, and they reinforce the fear and the prejudice of people. And they point to an other, the immigrant. Predominantly for such people, it's the immigrant, it's the cheat, it's the person just above you or the person just below you who is threatening your already vulnerable position. And to my mind, that, and if we don't, and I said at the very beginning, part of what I'm wired to do is to figure out, why do you do that? Because if we don't understand how Boris Johnson worked, we can't challenge the way he works and the way those people work. So it's not enough to say they're wrong and get into a barney over it. You have to figure out how are they managing to persuade people that the earth is flat? Because if you don't understand how they're managing to do it, it's very difficult. And those are the laws of business. I see business people, they know if you're trying to sell something. My son works with us in the charity, and we call him our resident capitalist. He doesn't like it, but he's an economist, and his head works. I learn a lot from him because his head works like a business head. So he knows what he's, if you don't know what the market is, if you don't know what you're selling, if you don't know how that other person is selling it, you can't compete. And the same is true for information. You can't compete with misinformation unless you know why and how it is marketable. Why are people buying misinformation? Unless you deconstruct that, you can't compete with information, if that makes sense.
Bernadette, that's a brilliant answer. I am so sorry, but we need to draw this to a close. I have about 10 questions. Maybe we'll have a chat outside afterwards. There's plenty of time for networking with tea and coffee. So we'll bring this to a close now, Bernadette. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we've brought our first panel now, if you want to join us up on the stage.
Thank you very much.